guys, and welcome back to another episode of Federico Wants Watches. Of course, before we get started, customary wristwatch check. Today, I'm wearing the Omega Speedmaster Apollo 14 Missions. It's a limited edition Speedy, but it's one of my favorites. I love the manual wind chronograph. It's an absolute classic.
Yeah, actually, I'm wearing my Jaeger LeCoultre Master Moon. It's called the Master Moon, even though it's a complete calendar. I'm going to throw it up there with my hand spread wide because my wrist is too thin to focus the autofocus. Can't pick me up. Complete calendar moon phase, black dial. You may notice something's changed. My glasses are tilted just slightly more to the left side. No, I'm kidding.
Is that all that's changed?
Okay, so we heard you loud and clear. Our set was a disgrace. We thought it looked like Beechwood when we set it up. We realized it looked like a 70s basement once we started filming.
Man, it was bad. Wayne's World, everybody said Wayne's World.
Yeah, you liked the Pacer references, and I'm into cars, so I dig that, but things had to change. I'm not Wayne, he's not Garth, and this is not our basement.
But this is only temporary because we are building a full-blown studio. We just thought this would tide us over for a little bit until we move into our new digs.
Yeah, and if you're wondering, the old 70s earth tones are behind this. This thing is my museum of memorabilia, catalogs, brochures, and magazines. We just moved it from the wall to the backdrop. We're like, how could that not be the background?
Today, I figured we'd bring an expert in, our in-house expert, Tim Masso, to discuss a subject that we've been asked a couple of times by email this week.
Yes.
And that is, Federico, Tim, what do you think of this vintage watch? Is it in good condition? So we'd figured we'd talk about what to look for when purchasing a vintage watch. What do you think, Tim?
Well, I think there are a couple of different ways to approach this. I think first you need to build yourself a small kit so you can really explore and scrutinize a watch. Never buy a vintage watch with either an unconditional return guarantee from a seller. So in other words, if you can't scrutinize it firsthand, you have to have some sort of assurance from the seller that they will let you send it back, no questions asked, if it doesn't check out when you get it, even if you just don't like it. Aged watches sometimes don't photograph well on the internet. If you're going to look at watches in person, A, phone a friend and bring them along, and B, be ready to at least ask the seller to remove things like straps so you can view Rolex serial numbers between lugs.
Make sure they're not polished out.
Bring a high-powered LED light. I like to use my bicycle light so you can go to work on those dials with at least a 10-power loop and a super bright light to see if any evidence of refinishing or foul play is present.
Exactly, and this is why buying vintage watches online is so difficult, because you can't see it firsthand. And on top of that, another thing that makes buying vintage watches tricky, in my opinion, is experience. Now, I can tell if a dial's been refinished most times, and people say, well, Federico, how do you do that? The truth is, I've just seen a lot of dials, and there's many factors which you just can't teach someone without the experience.
And I can relate them a little bit. I mean, we're going to assume that no outright fraud is being attempted and that a seller who may not be knowledgeable is simply offering a watch in good faith. You have to be your own detective. When I talk about having a kit, I talk about having things like the loop and the light, the guarantee from the seller. Fed, I think we can agree that 3 things to look for on a dial specifically would be even printing.
Even printing, and usually if it's been redialed, you'll see sloppy edges on markers and print. That's an indication of just too much ink or paint.
Yeah. When something's stylized, like the Jaeger LeCoultre script on a dial, and Fed is going to call up magically a graphic of the JLC logo. But when you see that on a dial, it has serifs, it has curly cues. To recreate that freehand, often in micro size, even a good redialer is going to make some mistakes. The original would have been transfer printed and damn near perfect.
Yes.
So look for, whenever something is a script or a corporate logo, look for perfection.
And another thing is, we should always make sure if the watch has luminescence, and this is vintage, the dial should match the color of the hands. So the loop markers should match the hands so it's aged evenly, because you can find a lot of service dials with old hands or new hands on original dials that will not have aged at the same time, so the color is different.
And beyond that, if there's any doubt, this is where your fact-finding carry kit comes in handy, because you take that 400 lumen bike light, or you just buy a really high-powered LED at Home Depot, make a little cup over the watch, soak it with light, and then cup it to see if the hands are luminescent while the rest of the dial goes dark.
Yeah, and actually another thing that should be mentioned, because we're talking about original parts, is original parts is part of what makes a vintage watch valuable. You can get a redial, you can buy something with new hands, but it will not be worth the same as a fully original piece. So provenance and full originality is really what brings the value to the certain watch.
And we talk a lot about dials, because especially in the world of Rolex, the dial is almost everything. Now I take exception to this beyond the blue chip range. Like I think you should consider watches holistically, but just focusing on dials because it's a collector mania. A lot of times when you look at a refinished dial, and why would you refinish a dial? You would refinish a dial to sell it to someone who values a clean appearance, who thinks the cleaner dial is the better dial, who can be sort of fooled into thinking a restoration is more valuable than a factory original with patina.
Which
That's why you'd refinish.
almost never is.
Yeah.
And also, what about damage? Because there's a difference between age and damage.
This is
right,
true.
Tim?
And I think damage is more evident on something like hands, because I feel like any dial that's being sold unscrupulously that has damage is going to be refinished. And then you'll see things like sloppy printing, uneven replacement of applied indexes.
Or even rust if it's been water damaged.
Rust, and you'll see on refinished dials with lacquer or paint, you'll see almost like orange peel, as you will on a badly painted car. When Fed talks about damage, I find most often that manifests in the hands. Not age so much as poorly replaced hands that are damaged at the center where they join their pinion.
Bent and stuff like that. And another thing, apart from the dial, because the dial is important, but it's not everything. Something I love to talk about, which is another thing I find is an experience. The only way you can tell is with experience is over polishing.
Yes.
So many people, when you polish many times with steel, you remove a little bit of metal. And it's more valuable to have a watch with scratches than it is to have a watch that's been polished a few times. And with the losing of that metal, it becomes asymmetric, or you lose some of the thickness or the lines of the case.
And this is especially important with many vintage Rolex watches, like early 5512s that have either square crown guards or tapered, pointy crown guards, as they call them. If you know the watch is in that serial number range, but it's been sanded down to toothpicks, dial's a lot, but it's not everything if you're not buying some astronaut's Paul Newman. The bottom line is that I think that's where you need to look at a watch holistically and say that over-polishing is under-preserving.
Absolutely. And then I think the hardest thing, and something that even I'm not too comfortable with because I don't have experience with every vintage caliber out there, far from it, is movements. I mean, do you have any tips for our viewers, Tim? How can you tell if you're looking at a completely original JLC movement, or if it's just machined parts that have been replaced?
Well, there are a couple of different ways. Like, we'll use JLC as my example. JLC U.S. market would have been imported with a certain number of concrete pieces of data printed onto the movement, the number of jewels, unadjusted. It would be marked Swiss, and there would be an import code. And these three-letter import codes, like LXJ for Jaeger-LeCoultre or VXN, both would be on vintage watches imported to the U.S. because that was our VXN, Vacheron. They were jointly imported by the Longines Wittnauer group. Or you might even see every once in a while something like AXA, which was one of the Longines Wittnauer stamps. But VXN is Vacheron, LXJ is JLC. Both are acceptable on vintage JLC movements. What's not acceptable is to see the stamp of a different brand on a movement that would have been shared across brands. Like JLC used the V72, and so did everyone else.
The Valjoux 72 movement, it's very common in vintage pieces. And actually, guys, this is what makes it so tricky. Every brand has its nuances. So do your homework online, and you can find these stamps or even what to look for certain watches by just doing a quick Google search.
Now, it's important to remember that while you can use your phone-a-friend companion who may or may not be an expert in vintage watches, and you can educate yourself extensively, and you can bring tools to inspect a watch and get assurances from the seller, the last missing piece is to have a reference. For almost every major brand, there is an authoritative guide by an author who has spent pretty much his life researching that brand. I mean, you're going to have the likes of Jeff Hess. You're going to have the likes of James Dowling. Obviously, Osvaldo Patrizzi has written extensively. So has John Goldberger for Rolex.
John Reardon for Patek Philippe. Franco Coloni for Cartier.
Yes, definitely. Also, you want to check Zaf Basha for JLC from roughly the mid-30s to early 1980s. And I would be remiss to not give a shout-out to Manfred Rosselaer for Zenith. Even a relatively niche brand is going to have at least one guy who spent ridiculous time in a Swiss library doing the research so you don't have to.
That's a fantastic tip. So ultimately, I mean, we just wanted to inform you because we've been getting this question a lot. And most of the times, the answer is no, that's not a good deal, or no, that watch is absolutely ruined. So please, especially if you're a new collector, do some homework. Don't always think that the best deal or the cheapest price is what you should get, especially when it comes to vintage.
Yeah, the quickest purchase is the cheapest price is often the quickest regret. So just remember that. Also, just to recap movements, if you have nothing else at your disposal, if you don't have a list of import codes, if you're not an expert in a particular brand or its movements, or if you're looking at a movement in a certain watch like an early Rolex Cosmograph that uses, like the V72 caliber, it was everywhere. How do you know that the movement in that watch is original parts or at least correct parts? You look for two things. One, you look at the watch as a standalone. Do all the parts look as though they've aged over the same period as a unit? If you find one part that's badly corroded, or if you find the movement as a whole has a lot of borderline corrosion patina on it, it might still function fine, but that could be your canary in the coal mine if the movement looks older, but you've got a bridge that looks brilliantly shiny.
That's a huge. I mean, you have to. It's common sense. It's even aging, and I'm not to say there's not some great deals out there. I picked up my Omega Chronostop limited issue for the Italian market. It's an aged dial, but not damaged, and I paid well under $1,000.
Dials and hands should age together and look like they've been together over the same period of time, and the same goes for movements. So look for both. Also, with movements, yes, everyone used the V72, but for instance, Rolex, I keep coming back because they're a standard of reference, is always going to have a certain type of finish that it applied. It did improve its movements. So if someone tries to throw in a piece of an old Benrus in there, you're going to see, beautiful Rolex gilt train wheels, and then something that looks like it was, put together by, the manufacturer of a tractor, not a watch. Look to make sure that all of the components appear to have been finished to the same standard, or at least
level,
in the same style.
Exactly. And on that note, guys, we hope you found this useful. Tim, thank you so much for kind of helping us and walking us through the movement side. It's certainly not something I'm an expert in. And let us know in the comment section below. Have you ever been kind of jerked around with a vintage watch? Have you had any problems? Let us know. We'd love to hear your stories. And on that note, please check out our Instagram account that's in the description below for some great watch photography and just watch content even on the days when we don't upload, which is rare nowadays, isn't it?
Yeah, if we have a slow day or a no day, believe me, tag me for it. That's on me, because Fed is updating content every 24 hours.
And of course, don't forget to subscribe so you can get more of us. I'm Tim. I'm not Tim. I'm Federico. You're Tim.
That's counterfeiting. I caught it in the act.
And you can catch us here almost every day. Thank you so much, and take care.